Michele Cobb es ya, le decía, resident speaker porque estuvo este año pasado en Reimagine, que es un evento que bastantes de vosotros conoceréis, que llevamos organizando desde hace muchos años. Y Michele es una voz clave, nunca mejor, hablando del mundo del audio, porque es la directora ejecutiva de la Asociación de Editores de Audio. Michele nos va a hablar de las tendencias globales. Please. The floor is yours.
All right, anyone who has ever seen me speak before, you know I'm trying to get my steps in, so I will wander this way and that. I'm here today to talk specifically about what's happening with audiobooks, not just in the US or North America, but a little bit of information from around the globe, and I look forward to your questions at the end here. So let's dive in. We have two surveys that we do in North America that are quite important for the publishers. And our association is dedicated to the publishers themselves, but we have many, many members. In fact, voice talent and producers are a big part of what we do and programming that we create. But the two big surveys that we do each year are the sales survey, which is done by Harris Interactive, and this takes actual data from each publisher and gives us the size of the market. And the funny thing was, 25 years ago, the original survey was done by people meeting in a bar and creating what they thought the size of the market was on the back of a napkin. It took us 10 years to unravel that number, but at the time, they said the industry was worth about $2 billion. And in fact, as we sit here today, that is the number that we are back at. So each year, we take all this data from publishers in North America, and we take a look at the revenue growth, and we have long been the sort of red-headed stepchild of publishing, but the fact of the matter is, audio publishing is growing faster than any publishing type in the North American market. And we have 12 years, 11 years of double-digit growth. So I've only brought 5 here, but you can see in the past 5 years, we've been growing rapidly. 2018 was a fantastic year with almost 35% growth in revenue. And then we dipped back down a little bit into, normal numbers of close to 15% growth. We saw a big uptick during the pandemic as people were looking for something to do that did not involve looking at a screen. And we're down in 2022 to a more normal number of about 10% growth. At the end of Q1 each year, we gather data from the publishers, so we are about to ask publishers for their information. And then we will publish 2023 data towards the second quarter of 2024. So in June, you can look for our new numbers. We also do some work with the Association of American Publishers, and they do stats on a monthly basis. Their stats tell us that those double digits are very likely to continue into 2023, so we're excited to see what those numbers are. As I looked at the difference between the AAP numbers, we're the APA, they're the AAP, I wanted to try and figure out what's happening in publishing for the audiobook versus books. And that's books in terms of the ebook market and the print book market. And so we took a look at the data, and we've seen that in the past 5 years, we've doubled the share of audiobooks as a portion of trade publishing. So we were about 11% of the market in 2022, very similar to ebooks. So if you take a look at that, that's about 22% of the overall trade publishing market in North America being 22%. So I was curious, how does that compare to around the globe? Well, we're higher than a lot of places, but the Nordics tend to outstrip us. So in Sweden, we saw in the same year about 28.5% was digital publishing between ebooks and audiobooks, and in Norway, it was all the way up to 31%. So we're doing well, and I know we're going to talk about the Nordics later, but not quite as well as the Nordics in terms of digital publishing. So I wanted to actually talk to our publishers about what they're doing in languages other than English. And of course, here we are in Spain, so I better have brought some data from the Spanish side of things. What I did was I talked to each of the major publishers in North America to find out how much they are doing in Spanish language out of the US and Canada. And we've seen that as a portion of sales, non-English language titles are in fact growing. I'll show you a data point a little later on, but we don't break down, is that Spanish? Is it Chinese? Is it French? We don't break down the data in that way. So by talking to the major publishers, I said, what are you guys doing? Well, what turns out, about half of them are producing some titles in Spanish. Specifically, this was for 2023. So about half of them are doing that. Some have done it in years previous, but did not do it in 23. And a few are planning to do more in 2024. So I think that Spanish is easily becoming the biggest title production language outside of English from North American publishers. And from what I can tell, altogether, the publishers did about 600 titles in Spanish last year, which is not insignificant. So let's take a look at the consumer data, and we're going to hear later from Edison Research, but we work at the APA with Edison each year to put together data on consumers. Now, these are specifically US consumers. Our publishers are globally based, but those that participate in the sales survey are based in the US and Canada. So that's North American data. Our consumer data actually focuses on the US, and we only survey adults. So for us, that's 18 and up. Well, the great news in 2023, post-pandemic, when everyone was doing a lot of listening, we found that for the first time, more than half of the US population of adults said that they had ever listened to an audiobook. That was a really big leap over the previous year, so we're very excited to see what happens in 2024. Our survey is being streeted now, so again in June, we'll be releasing information about consumer behavior in the US in regard to audiobooks. There's a lot of discussion about, is there going to be a big change? Because there are new players coming into the US market. We really haven't done a lot with the streaming model in the US. It's been much more built on the credit-based model. So someone pays $15 each month for a credit. They can choose an audiobook. Could be short, could be long. When you get into streaming, and we've seen this with Storytel across the globe, and really a couple of retailers in the US, Scribd, for instance, does a streaming model. But in November of last year, Spotify launched, as part of their subscription, you could listen to up to 15 hours per month of audio with no additional cost. Now, journalists have really tried to get me to say this has had a big impact on sales, positive or negative. We can't really tell from the data yet because we haven't collected that 2023 data, but also it started in November, so it's not necessarily going to give a good reflection of what's happening with that type of model until the end of 2024. So look for that in our 2025 data. What's great, and I think you're going to find this in country after country, the listeners are getting younger. When I started in the industry in the late 1990s, the majority of listeners were 55 and up. Today, 57% of people that listen are between the ages of 18 and 44. They're starting younger, they're going to live longer, they're staying with the format, so there is a lot of potential room for growth in our revenue. So that's really exciting to see. Also, Our listeners in the US tend to be more diverse than the US population. So 27% of the US population identifies as African American or Hispanic. 29% of listeners identify in that way. We're seeing in general in publishing that there is a lot of interest in having more diverse books published, and we are seeing that trickle into the audiobooks. Now, before publishers were really spending a lot of time talking about diversity of titles, in 2018, we met, the Audio Publishers Association, with a number of different publishing organizations, and they were thinking very much, how do we publish more diverse books? We were thinking, how do we find narrators that can actually read these diverse books? Well, thank you, pandemic. All of those performers who couldn't be on stage, who couldn't be in television, who couldn't be in movies, were looking for something to do. And they have come and started to record audiobooks. So we've gotten more diverse in listeners, we've gotten more diverse in content, and we've gotten more diverse in the people that are able to read the content, which is very exciting. All right, genres. This again comes from the sales survey, so it's actual sales dollars. In the US, we like our fiction. We see big jumps in fiction versus nonfiction in political years. Maybe you've heard 2024 is going to be an election year in the US, so I expect we're going to see some political books coming in 2024 and 2025 that might drive nonfiction a bit higher again. Overall, for the past decade, we have been publishing and selling more nonfiction, but fiction continues to be king. But what's lovely and fun about the US is that we absolutely love blood, guts, and murder, whether it be in podcasts or in books, mysteries, true crime. If people die, we want to read it. However, in the past year, we saw something different happen. For the first time, science fiction and fantasy actually surpassed mystery, suspense, thriller. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons for this. For me personally, I cannot read science fiction and fantasy with my eyes because I don't know what the word is supposed to sound like. The narrator can do that for me. Also, in the pandemic, as people were listening to a lot of audio and they had more time, what were they thinking about? Long books in the credit model. And so that's exactly what they did. They looked for those long titles, and that tends to be more in those science fiction fantasy titles. So it over-indexed a bit. You can also see the pandemic effect here. Why? We're sitting at home, we're not having fun, what would we like? Humor titles. Okay, we want to work on ourselves and do those personal development. Nonfiction in the personal development area was growing a bit. And then, of course, no one was on Tinder, so we all went to the romance titles. However, the fastest growing categories are children's, and we're going to talk about why in a minute, and that non-English language titles. Okay, so we grew, it doesn't feel like a lot when you say from 3% to about 4%, but it was actually 37% growth in revenue for non-English language titles in 2022, and I think we're going to see more of that in the 2023 numbers when they come out. All right, we have returned, sadly, to the pre-pandemic numbers. The average listener listens to about 6 titles per year. It jumped up to close to 7 during the pandemic, but we're back down to normal size. And here is the number that I want you all to take a very careful look at. In 2020, 35% of parents said that their kids were listening to audiobooks. Okay, just 3 years later, that has jumped to 56%. When we all got locked down and our kids were looking at that screen all day long, what were we looking for them to do? Something else that didn't involve looking at a screen, and that's where audiobooks came in. And what's lovely is when you start listening as a young person, again, you're very likely to continue listening throughout your life, so it speaks to the potential long-term health of our market. All right, I'm sure as I look down and see many of you on your smartphones, it is no surprise, and it doesn't matter which country you're in, the smartphone is king. We asked people in our survey both where they listen and where they listen most. Smartphone comes in number 1, and car speaker actually comes in pretty far down, despite the fact that when you say, what are you doing while listening, driving comes up very high. So we know that is for a couple of reasons. First of all, many people still plug their phone into the car. So they're listening on the car speaker, but they're thinking about their phone being on mobile. And if you like to listen and you like to wander, you see I like to wander around, the smartphone is perfect. I don't have to worry about the smart speaker. I put it in my back pocket. I can go walking. I can do whatever I want. I can wander around the house. Now, one of the things that we have seen, and we didn't believe, I remember going to an event where we had people being surveyed with a facilitator, and all the publishers were behind a glass wall. And the facilitator was saying, what do you do while you listen to audiobooks? And we sat behind the wall and we thought, they're all going to say driving, they're all commuting, they're all going to say running, they're exercising. Person after person said, I use audiobooks to relax. And here we are about 15 years later, and every survey tells us that that is true. So when we ask people, what are you doing? The number one answer is, I'm not doing anything when I listen to audiobooks. Many people use them to go to sleep, but also tons of people just sit at their house and relax and listen. For those of us that are in the car a lot, driving is obviously high. And then if you want to do laundry or iron or the dishes, using audiobooks can be a great way to pass that time, as well as, of course, doing things outdoors, like gardening. I did want to bring our newest survey data to you. We've been working with Library Journal, School Library Journal, to work with understanding what's happening in libraries. And libraries are a place of discovery for audiobooks. So we've seen in the past year circulation increases for digital, no shock there. Circulation decreases for CDs, again, not a big surprise. But a couple of figures that I wanted to point out. Again, audiobooks are about 11% of trade publishing. This follows very closely with libraries saying they're spending about 10% of their materials budget in libraries on audiobooks. That makes sense. What's interesting is we see that for audiobook listeners, librarians told us about 25% of people buying audiobooks or borrowing them from the library are not borrowing any other formats. Again, this speaks to the health of what's happening. And the one I want to point out, we might be talking a little bit about AI, maybe not AI voices, but librarians say that although the voice talent is not the number one reason why someone picks a title, it's usually talent, title or author, it is heavily influential on whether or not they finish the title. And more importantly, if they have the option to buy something with a non-human voice, currently librarians say this will negatively impact their decision to select that title. We know this is going to change over the years, but this is where people are today. All right, let's take a look at some of the figures from around the world. Okay, 19% of consumers in France, this is 15 and up, say that they have listened to an audiobook. You can see in the US, we've had audiobooks in the market a lot longer, so we have a much higher percentage. About 4% of total sales of the publishing market are devoted to audio, compared to about 11% in the US. And we see an annual growth rate of about 3%. These are 2022 figures, so we've had places like Storytel have come into the market since then that may have had an impact. But I think it's interesting to compare where other countries are to the US, which really started 40 years ago selling audiobooks, thanks to several salespeople who were spending all the time in their car wanting something else to do. It caused them to actually start these companies. All right, in Germany, we've seen an increase between 2022 and 2019 of about 35% of revenue in audiobooks, and about a 6.5% increase between 21 and 22. In 2022, we saw that the share of the market was heavily download. Streaming was next, and you'll notice that physical was only about 13%. Currently in the US, it's only about 2% of the market. And then I love these next figures, and see if I've tricked you sufficiently. So we've seen that between 21 and 22, download, there was about 60% growth. We saw in streaming, a huge increase of 150%, and of course, CDs. 54% change in their revenue. Unfortunately for CDs, that was negative, not positive. So again, CDs are not the growing piece, cars don't have them in it, and there's lots of reasons for that. All right, and finally, let's end up with the UK. Okay, spending was up in 2023 about 12%. Compared to that 4% in France, we see 8% of total book purchases are in audio, and that's up from 5% in 2019. And we see those continued. It feels like small when you compare 5 to 8% on some level, but if you think about how much revenue that is year over year, it's a significant increase. And, you know, the Brits, they like the nonfiction better than the fiction. Currently, we see that in many countries. Nobody likes their murder and fiction as much as those of us in the US. All right, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so happy to take some. I've stumped you all. Yes.
Thank you. So there is this interesting point about AI-narrated books, and could you give us a picture, because you mentioned that it's until now it has a negative effect upon the choice if the book is narrated by the AI, and you told that this behavior is going to change. And can you give us a picture and more or less how the market is going to merge between AI-narrated books and the talent-narrated books? If it's possible, if you have some data about that, and give us a little picture about it. Thank you.
Yes, I can get out my crystal ball. So it's very scary for the publishers and especially for the voice talent to think about what happens when AI comes in the market. So what we do as the Audio Publishers Association is we try to educate people. So about a year ago, what we tried to do was a survey, because Apple had launched AI books, and we were seeing more coming into the market from a variety of vendors. So we worked with the Portland State University to find titles that had been published in an AI voice and look at reviews of those titles to get a sense of what the consumer response was. Unfortunately, at that time, there were almost no reviews of those titles. So what that told us was they weren't selling particularly well. They were sort of lower level titles in terms of the hierarchy of people's interest. And so we were not able to do a clear study of what the response was. In every consumer survey, we ask, what's your tolerance for AI voice? I don't think people have heard enough of it to really know. So it still seems that the human voice in all the surveys is what people prefer, but I think we don't have a clear picture because they haven't put things side by side. Ultimately, I think what we're going to see are a lot of titles that are being recorded with an AI voice that would not get recorded in a human voice, and we've started to see that with Audible. They have allowed Kindle titles to be available with a virtual voice. What the sales figures are, we don't have a good sense of that yet. I do want to caution everyone to not panic, especially if you're a voice talent in the room. We do believe in the power of the human voice, and that performance so far is completely unreplaceable by an AI voice. And we've seen that in other industries. We've seen it in film, we've seen it in television, where they use elements of AI performance, but those are still human-based. So I personally believe we are always going to have a portion of titles that are handled by a single voice narrator human, then a multi-voiced where they don't interact, and then those full dramatizations as well. But as of yet, I don't have clear data to say what the response is.
¿Alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta en español? Que la haga y se lo traducimos, si se siente más cómodo. Gracias.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. I'm going to go in Spanish, as for the audience. Me gustaría saber, porque han salido varios formatos de recepción de audiolibros. Ha hablado del streaming, ha hablado de lo físico, ha hablado también de las grabaciones. Bueno, me gustaría como escuchar cuáles son y si considera también que la lectura de un PDF por una IA, como cualquier aplicación de lectura en alto, también se considera audiolibro.
Two questions that you mentioned, different formats, like a streaming, unit sounds, the different formats. And then the second question is like the reading on a PDF with synthetic voice. Would you consider that an audiobook?
Great question. So for the different formats, we don't separate out currently streaming versus download. We just call it all digital. What we're finding is we can't do unit sale questions anymore because some publishers are doing minutes as opposed to one unit, even though many retailers report by units. So we don't have a clear picture in the US of what the difference is in terms of the actual revenue dollars. We do find that about 41% of consumers say that they are, on a subscription of some kind. Until November of last year, there were not a lot of streaming options. Most everything was still credit download. So I think some of that potential data is going to come in the future. All right, and then the other question was, if a machine is just reading a PDF, is that an AI voice? Well, I think there's different types of AI. So there's that text-to-speech, where it's just the machine reading something. These are important things to happen for accessibility. I think a lot of that is actually probably going to go away, and we are going to have more of these performance-generated titles, which could be a person reading a bunch of different words and creating a voice, or even just taking archival audio and creating that voice. I think more and more will go in that direction because it is a better experience than just, the sort of robotic sound of the voice. Where it's all going to go, hard to say. I spend about half of my time just trying to calm everyone down.
Muchísimas gracias, Michele. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for your time.